Welcome to Secure Software Development. We're going to begin the way we begin every class by talking about BBN and paging. In 1969, BBN wanted a computer that would do memory paging. They wanted to use virtual memory. So they had a PDP-10, but PDP-10s didn't have virtual memory and paging. Now, paging existed. It had been around and in implementation since 1963. Atlas was the first computer to have paging implemented on it, but the PDP-10 didn't. So BBN's resourceful. They have a bunch of engineers. They bought a PDP-10 and they created custom hardware to implement paging, and then they wrote a custom operating system, 10X, that would implement paging. So there you go. Now, in this, there was a trap to user bit you could set, so when a specific page was accessed, the user would be notified by an interrupt. Probably useful for debugging the paging system, possibly useful for other purposes as well, maybe for debugging programs. Don't really know why it was in there, but that was one of the features that was in there. Anyway, now the program could use virtual memory. Great, that's awesome. So 10X was a multi-user system. It used password authentication for each person to log in. In order for you to authenticate, there was a system call. They think it's JSYS, and that's the system call on the PDP-10 architecture. So you would initiate a system call to the password checking system, and you give it two strings, a username and the passwords. And unsurprisingly, it either returned success or failure. And because these are smart people, it also imposed a delay. So if you tried to guess a password, you know what? There was a 3-second delay after failing to guess the correct password before you could guess again. So it slowed you down and made it hard for you to repeatedly guess passwords. Right? It's the 1960s, but still, we're learning. So, checking passwords. The provided password was compared to a stored password, one character at a time. I mean, that's how you compare strings, right? You just go across, you look at are the first characters equal? If they are, great, keep going. If they're not, immediately stop and report an error. That's how string compare works. That's how you compare things. So suppose you split the password. You arrange for the password to be in memory, and you split the password so that the first character of the password is in one page, but the rest of the password is in the subsequent page. So now, when the comparison system runs, it loads the first page, it checks that character, that first character. If it's wrong, there's a 3-second delay and it reports failure. If it's right, then it immediately loads that second page so it can get to the rest of the password. And you can use that trap to user bit to generate an interrupt when that second page is loaded. So that suggests, let's guess the first character. If we're right, the second page will now be accessed and we'll get an interrupt. And my program will know that the first character was right. If I'm wrong, then there's a 3-second delay and I get back a failure. I can tell those two things apart. So I can now automate a process of guessing the password, at least guessing the first character. What about the second character? I just shift the password over one spot. So I know the first character is right. It then checks the second character, and either it then goes on to the next page or it reports an error. And I played the same game until I have pushed the entire password through and guessed it. Great. Whenever we're wrong, we just increment the character until we're right, and we just keep going. So this lets us guess the password one character at a time until we get it right. And yeah, it might take a while because of the 3-second delay, but we'll still get there. And if you do the math, you'll find out you'll get there pretty fast. If the interrupt thing is bugging you, it's like, that's a bad idea. You don't actually have to have that. You could mark the second page as not readable. And in that case, you'll get a different kind of interrupt when you access the second page, and you can still tell them apart. So that was just a really convenient thing to use, but there were other ways to do that as well. So this is a vulnerability. Well, it was discovered by Alan Bell. And Alan Bell, like all discoverers of vulnerabilities, went on to write some exploit code to demonstrate that you could, in fact, guess a password this way. And he went to lunch with Ray Tomlinson, and he told him about this. Ray Tomlinson's the inventor of email. They recruited Bob Clements. Bob Clements is probably the first person to receive an email from someone else, namely from Ray Tomlinson. First email ever sent was from Ray to himself. Second one was likely from Ray to Bob. So it's a heady group of people. So Bob Clements then wrote a patch to address the vulnerability. So how would you address this vulnerability? Well, he thought about it and he said, the problem is that the password can be across these two pages, and you can then tell if the first character was right because only then is the second page accessed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the program look at the first character, but not check it, and look at the last character, but not check it. So that would then force the triggering of the event or so forth before any characters were actually checked. And then I could go and check all of the characters after that. So I've already forced the interrupt or forced the whatever's going to happen before any checking takes place. So that solves the problem. Now, in 1974, there was no responsible disclosure process, but the folks at BBN decided they wanted to be sure that no one had an advantage and could take advantage of this patch and exploit it. So they wrote a patch, they notified everyone there was going to be a security patch, and they released it to everyone with an affected computer, a PDP-10 with custom hardware running 10x. And there were probably about 18 to 20 of them at the time. And so they went out to all at the same time, and everybody could apply the patch. So this got the team thinking about password security more generally. They were like, well, checking password this way was a bad idea. But you know what's also a bad idea? Maybe having unencrypted passwords just lying around in system files, maybe that's a bad idea. So they recruited Bob Thomas. Bob Thomas is the creator of the first computer worm, Creeper. Sometimes you'll hear Morris referred to as the creator of the first computer worm. Bob created Creeper before Morris did. He just didn't let his get loose and take down the nascent internet. So Bob Thomas wrote the encryption code. Bob Clements then updated the password code, and now we have encrypted passwords, and we're beginning down this long, treacherous, never-ending path of password security, exploit security, exploit security. The PDP line of computers, starting with, I think, the first major influential one was probably the PDP-6, but the PDP-10 in particular, extremely influential computer. A report on 20 years of the PDP-10 was created by Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, and there's a link to go and download it. It's interesting stuff. An amazing amount of science was done using these machines. An amazing array of fascinating developments in computing were developed on these machines. So before we get into the main topic for today, I want to get a little aside out of the way. It'll become relevant later on, and I'll explain why. But for now, let's just take a look at something that a fellow named John Ioannidis once said. Science is the best thing that has happened to human beings, but we can do it better. We can do science better. So what he was referring to are these issues that had periodically come up in the conduct of science, and in particular when people would look at publications and try to replicate the results. So going all the way back to 1966, we find this paper by Stanley Shore and Irving Carton. And what they did was they went and found a list of the most frequently read medical journals, and they picked 10 of those. They then selected papers from the first 3 months of 1964, just randomly. They had a protocol, and they would select more papers, and you can read about that. I think actually the selection method is on the page that I've actually put on the slide. And they did this until they had built up a corpus of 295 papers. These are medical journal papers reporting the results of experimentation to other doctors in highly regarded, or at least highly read, medical journals. And what they found was surprising. They got together a panel and they reviewed these papers. They weren't reviewing them to say, is this part correct or is this part correct? What they were doing was they were looking at the experimental methods used. How did you design the experiment? What was your sample size? What did you observe during it? And they asked a fairly reasonable question. They asked, can the conclusions that are drawn in this paper and presented to doctors, can those conclusions be justified based on their experimental design? And they found that in about 73% of the reports that they looked at, the justification for the conclusions was invalid given the experimental design and the observations. So they didn't go through and say, we think your observation is wrong, or we think that your hypothesis is wrong, or we think that your experimental design is bad. They just said, given what you said you did, are you justified in drawing the conclusion that you present in your paper? And in 73% of the cases, they concluded, no, you're not. Well, okay. Science is about discovering universal principles. Now, do universal principles exist? Is the universe governed by a consistent set of underlying principles that we can discover? Maybe. I mean, that's sort of the conceit behind science, is that there are these principles we can discover. And we can then use those principles. If I know what they are, then I can predict how a particular thing will occur. And that's good for me, right? Because I want to be able to do that. I want to build bridges and be able to predict with a high degree of accuracy that the bridge won't fall down when the wind blows or a car goes across it. I want to predict with a high degree of accuracy that a plane taking off in LAX will land successfully in London. I want to be able to do these. In order to do that, I need to be able to reason based on a set of consistent principles. So that's what I'm looking for. So because that's the way I want things to work, I focus on repeating experiments and showing that I'm able to predict the result of it based on what I've seen previously. I want to basically argue from induction. Now, the first level of that is I conduct an experiment and I see a particular outcome. It could be a fluke. It could be the result of something that I haven't properly controlled for in the lab. It could be a result of an error. Maybe my equipment wasn't clean enough, or maybe there was some disruption during the experiment. So I do it again. Repeating the same experiment with the same experimental setup and the same team is just repeating the experiment. Repeating is important because that lets me know what does normal variation look like, and have I controlled for enough sources of variation for me to be reasonably certain that I've got a good result. Okay? But it's the same team and it's the same experimental setup. Maybe all of us are looking at it and we're just missing something. We think we're seeing something, but in reality, we're not seeing what we think we're seeing. How do you check for that? Well, that's where replication comes in. An experiment is replicated when a different team uses my experimental setup to repeat my experiment. This is where a lot of things can fall over. In particular, two things come to mind. One of them is N-rays. You can look up N-rays. People believed N-rays existed. They could see them. They could measure them. But when people tried to replicate the experiments, they couldn't see them. They didn't find them. Another one is polywater. There were actually conferences on polywater and grave concern about it. But when people tried to replicate the polywater results, they were unable. Cold fusion, right? When Pons and Fleischmann announced the results of their cold fusion work, others tried to replicate it and were unable. So replication is where we go to weed out not necessarily bad science. It's certainly the case that many of these scientists were acting responsibly. They were conducting experiments. They were repeating their experiments. They were seeing what they believed to be real effects. But as best we could tell now, it seemed like they were wrong. Okay? And it's possible to do things right and still end up wrong. So replication is critical to the conduct of science. If you've truly uncovered this principle, some universal principle, that's great. That means I can design a different experiment based around the same principle that you think you've discovered, and I can now predict the result of that and reproduce it. That is reproduction of the experiment using a different team or a different experimental setup. And that's great. This all leads me to better and better confidence in whatever we've discovered. And that takes us to the replication crisis. Replication is critical. But who does that? Who is responsible for replicating your experiment? Well, it's not you, because by definition, it's not you. It's another team somewhere else replicating what you did. It's somebody else trying to get the same result. And that, by definition, can't be you. So you're not responsible for that. Someone else is. But who's paying for that? Right? Who's doing that work? And a lot of times that work is not done. And what we see is that, reports go out, and if later on we try to reproduce them and we can't replicate them, does that mean the original report was full of lies, intentional lies? No, not really. We don't know what happened. All we know is we can't replicate it, and that calls the conclusion into question. Now, certainly there have been cases where people have behaved improperly. The hunt for discovering new elements, new heavy elements, there's a great story around that I don't have time to get into, but basically it looks like a researcher fabricated the discovery of a few heavy elements, eventually got caught. But it's not always the case that people are fabricating this. People can honestly believe that they're seeing a real phenomenon, and that's why we have to do this replication. So priming is a psychological phenomenon where I show you something, I give you a stimulus, and that primes you to respond to a later stimulus without conscious intention. Think about subliminal messages in movies and TV and music. Think about me repeatedly showing you two things that are in connection. And then later when you see one of those two, you immediately call to mind the second. But it's just unbidden. You don't think, I need to remember that second thing. It just comes in your head because you've developed an association between those two. We know that priming is a real thing, right? And you should know that from your own life, right? If you experience something, some horrific event, and it's associated with watching The Godfather, like you're watching The Godfather when something terrible happens. Later on, when you watch The Godfather, you may have a visceral reaction because you're recalling that terrible thing. So priming is the real thing. The question is, how strong is it? Right? Can I hide a subliminal message in a movie and then use that to trick your brain into doing something else later on? Well, I mean, if I say I can, that's certainly interesting, and I'll probably get published for that kind of result. So a lot of studies on priming kept finding higher and higher and higher degrees of activation from priming. It began to be, building up much more, right? I show you a glance of a picture of a grapefruit, and now you're trying to murder your relatives. So, okay. Studies on priming were used heavily in other areas of psychological research, right? Scientists rely on the work of other scientists, right? I don't have time to do everything. So if you say priming works this way, and I say, okay, well, I'm going to conduct my experiment based on the fact that priming works this way, or likely works this way. But in 2012, along came the replication crisis. And as they tried to reproduce these classical results on priming, they discovered they couldn't. And a lot of that priming research had to be thrown out because we simply could not reproduce it. So over on the right-hand side is an essay by John Ioannidis, who we quoted at the beginning of this lecture, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. It's a really interesting paper. You should read it. And he's being a little provocative, and he even says, I'm being a little provocative here. I don't think, all research is bad or that people are trying to do some bad stuff. I think that if we just look statistically at how stuff is being done, people conduct experiments, they don't report failures, they only report successes. There's pressure to publish in this way. I think we can conclude that a lot of what's out there just isn't true, or it doesn't have a sufficient basis to say that it's true. Maybe it's not false, but it didn't have a sufficient basis to say it's true. So it's an interesting paper, and I do suggest that you read it. Now, priming has not been disproven, but its effect was likely overstated due to experimenter effects, right? I'm the experimenter. I'm directly interacting with my subject, and I'm basically coaching you, consciously or unconsciously, to respond the way I want you to so that I can get a result that is going to get me published in a high-profile journal and let me make interesting claims. In addition, there's a publication effect because the journals, they like this stuff, right? This is provocative stuff, and they want to publish it. Combination of those two is not great, right? Seeking this sort of heightened news and then publishing the hype, that's something that none of us can really relate to, but it's something that happened. And that takes us to decision making. So getting all that out of the way, you'll see why I went through that in just a few moments. How do you make decisions? What are you doing? Well, we used to think, humans make rational choices. You're a rational agent, and that's how the economy works, and that's what people do. That idea, the rational actor idea, is so thoroughly debunked by just masses of accumulated evidence that it's pretty much gone. So what's in its place now? Well, there are a couple competing theories, but one of them is the dual process hypothesis. And this states that performing a decision, right, doing the work of figuring out what you want to do, and then introspection, explaining to me why you did that, represent different underlying processes. Now, you would think that they're basically the same, right? Do you want an apple or an orange? And I tell you, I want an orange. And you're like, why do you want the orange? And now you give me your reasons. You tell me why you made the decision to choose the orange. The research tells us that's not really what you're doing. When you make the decision, maybe you do think carefully through it, but you probably make the decision that the orange just seems tastier to you. And then when I ask you why you want it, you tell me, well, I was looking at the two, and the apple looks like it's maybe a little mealy, and I don't really want an apple right now. And the orange is sweet, and you give me a bunch of reasons, and maybe those are valid, and maybe those factor into your decision. But what we find is the processes underlying the reasoning performance, making the choice, are not generally available for introspective report. You're not thinking carefully through this process. You're making a decision, and the machine with your brain makes a decision. And then when you ask for an introspective account of performance, you construct a justification based on your knowledge that is consistent with what you just gave me, what you just told me. And Wasson in 1974 did some work to show that this is how people operate. It's a clever experiment. You might want to read about it. He basically got people to make decisions and do it in a way so that they could tell that the performance, making a decision, and the introspection, tell what happened later, were really distinct things. In fact, he could basically get him to give him a description, show that was wrong, give him more evidence, and then they would give him the same description that was wrong, but in different words. It's a clever paper. It's interesting to read. And it's also not implicated, as far as I can tell, in the replication crisis. So to get through your day, you make a lot of decisions rapidly, and you do that with little conscious thought. So Daniel Kahneman, and I've left the date out there, I apologize, it's in the citations at the end, suggests that there are two processes at work in decision making, and he calls them System 1 and System 2. And there are several papers that lead up to this, and then the System 1 and System 2 language appears in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a fairly famous work in the field. Thinking Fast and Slow references work on priming. Parts of the book lean on work on priming that we know we can't replicate. So at least part of what Kahneman was saying in his work is based on what may just be bad science, or science that can't be replicated. Now, to his credit, Kahneman is very receptive to this. He always responds to his critic. He's quick to jump in and say, yes, this was wrong. I didn't know. Right? I mean, how would you have known? Life is too short to do everything. And he's been quick to correct the errors and adapt. And the parts of, as best I can tell, the parts of his work that I'm talking about here are not affected by this, or not directly affected by this. So System 1 and System 2, still something we can move on with, but I want to get that out of the way. System 1 is fast. So System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, associative. You're in the same situation you were in before. You recall what happened in that situation and let you take an action. It's how you learn to do things. And emotional. And that's great, because a lot of times you need to make snap decisions when a car pulls directly in front of you, or someone steps off the curb, or you think about stepping off the curb, or a dozen other things happen in your life each day. You need to make some quick judgments about that. Handle routine tasks efficiently and deal with threats quickly. So handling routine tasks efficiently. What I mean there is efficiently with respect to your body's own regulation. You can do this with little or no effort. You don't have to engage all your brain. You don't have to use up all the sugar in your blood to make this decision. You can react because you've been in that situation before. You know what to do. You just do it, right? A part of your brain engages and does it. You don't have to engage your entire brain. And often you can be doing other things while you are unconsciously making thousands of decisions. You do this every day. You drive a car. If you drive a car, you're probably thinking about what to have for dinner or what you watched on TV or a million other things while you're making a lot of life and death decisions in every second. Okay? And you're able to do that because you have this fast, automatic, intuitive, associative, emotional system. This system relies on heuristics. Heuristics are a fancy word for rules of thumb. For novel or complex problems, it's probably going to get it wrong. We know, right, from the history of the world that common sense is when you apply it to things you've seen before, it works pretty well. When you apply it to new stuff, it doesn't work so well, right? The world looks flat. Common sense tells you the world's flat. And then you begin to make other observations. You try to reconcile those observations with the idea of a flat earth. And before long, something doesn't add up and it gets broken. Still, conclusions from System 1 may form the bedrock for more complex decision making. And you should be aware of that, right? I've reached a conclusion. The conclusion might be, I don't like people from Hawaii. And I do that because I have a neighbor, and my neighbor's drives me nuts. And so I unconsciously developed this bias against people from Hawaii, my neighbors from Hawaii. It just makes me crazy. And so when I interact with new people, and I see that they have the same mannerisms or the same accent, or they look like him, I have a unconscious bias against them. And later on, when I'm making decisions or rationalizing decisions, I need to rationalize around that bias. And that can skew my decision making, even when I'm not trying to use System 1. And we're all prone to that. I worked with a fellow who was Vietnamese, and he was not the greatest person to work with. It really was just a jerk. And that colored my thinking. And when I came to Oak Ridge, my boss, Joe Trin, was Vietnamese, very similar manner of speech, a lot of similar mannerisms. And I had this sort of hesitancy, but he turned out to be one of the nicest people I've ever known, and I love the guy to death. He's absolutely just wonderful. And, working to not let that color my relationship with him was great, because he's just an absolutely incredible person. System 2 is slow. It's deliberative, analytical, rule-based. And this is what we do when we're doing complex, abstract, or unfamiliar tasks, right? Your kid comes home and it's like, I need to do this thing for geometry. And you're like, how do you find the eccentricity of an ellipse? What even is what is that? So then I got to read stuff and think about it. And I've got to read about, so I got to measure the distance between the center and the outside and the center and the focus, and take the ratio. Okay, I know what this is. So you got to work through that deliberatively. And that's what System 2 is good at. System 2 is energy intensive. Doing that means that you have to use up the sugar in your blood, right? More of your brain has to be engaged. You have to be able to hold multiple things in your head at once, right? Maybe a picture of an ellipse, maybe information about what a focus is, maybe information about the axes and so forth, and you've got to put all this together in order to do it, and then you have to reproduce this. You have to organize the information in a way that you can explain it to your kid, that you can write out what they need to do, and you can help them then do their homework. It's energy intensive. Doing this kind of thing can lead to fatigue, right? And that leads to distractions, and it can also let you be influenced by what are seemingly irrelevant factors just because you become tired, right? You've used up the sugar in your blood, you need a snack, you need a nap, but someone is coming at you with a new problem to solve. Heightened emotion can short-circuit this process, right? Feelings of anger, disgust, even joy can interrupt this process and let you fall back on system 1. And you're prone to manipulation. Look, you have to make a lot of decisions through your day just to stay alive and stay healthy and stay safe. And System 1 exists to let you do that. System 1 is also subject to emotional manipulation by others, right? They want to engender in you feelings of fear, disgust, anger, and that can make you more susceptible to manipulation. And I've cited a paper there that really goes into how that works, cites the research on that. Feelings of disgust can shape your judgments about people or groups of people, even when there is no rational justification for these judgments. Right? You conclude that, these people are bad because of this, or they're bad because of that. And maybe none of those things are true, but you haven't thought it through to realize those things aren't true because they have already short-circuited your thinking by getting you to feel disgust, or to feel anger, or to feel like they're betraying you or something else. Manipulative rhetoric leverages System 1 by using emotionally charged language, fear-based messaging, and stereotypes. Now, no one would do that to you today, I'm sure, but there you go. After you've made a decision, you may then go back and use System 2 to construct a justification. And then you'll believe the justification. And we know that's sort of how you function. We know that because of other research as well. You tell me, I don't like those people. Well, why? Because of this. And you construct the justification, and then you've now input that justification back into your brain, and that becomes your justification going forward. Just be careful with this stuff. So let's shift gears just a little bit, and let's talk about these 4 primary, there are others, but these are the 4 primary approaches to ethics that are dominant in the literature. Rule-based ethics comes from Kant. Act in a way that you would see become an objective, universal law. If you're going to do this, it should be okay for everyone to do it. Is that okay? Is that the world you want to live in? If it is, great. Then that's the kind of thing we should do. If it's not, then you don't do it. Act so you treat humanity always as an end and never as a means. What is that telling you? Well, don't treat people as tools, as a means to accomplish some end for yourself, right? Don't do that, right? People aren't just a thing to use to accomplish something for yourself, some end for yourself. People should be regarded as ends in themselves. They're other conscious creatures just like you. You can go read A Theory of Justice by John Rawls, or there's a quick crash course video you can watch if you love you some YouTube. Contract ethics comes to us from Hobbes. Right acts are those that don't violate the free, rational agreements that we've made with others. And they can be explicit, right? I can tell you, I'll go pick you up at the bus stop at 5. I should go do that because that's a good thing to do. Not just standing you up. It's a bad thing to do. I just ghost you at the bus stop. That's not good. And they can be implicit, right? You're my son, and I need to go get you from school because you're my son. Okay? And they can be societal. They can be because we're in a group, because we're in relationships. And you should go read What We Owe to Each Other by Scanlon. And of course, there's a crash course video on it as well. Consequentialist ethics comes to us from Jeremy Bentham. An act is good or bad based on the consequences of that act. You may have had good intentions, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the result of what you did is objectively bad. Okay, so there are problems with all of these approaches, but this one says, really, we're going to look at what happens and we're going to see if it's good or bad based on the outcome. And he tells you to act to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. And a good book on that is Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. Crash course on that as well. And finally, virtue ethics comes to us from way back in history from Aristotle. And he said, you should aspire to be virtuous. You should look around you and you should see who are the people who command respect, who you admire, who seem to be good people. Observe what they do. Do what they do. Right? You will become a good person because you will cultivate good habits. You will seek to become courageous, temperate, right? You're not going to fly off the handle and you're not going to just ignore problems. You're going to be in the middle. You're going to be temperate. You're going to be just, and you're going to be wise. And if you can, to the extent you can achieve these things, you will live a good life and you'll be a virtuous person. We won't know that for sure until after you're dead, because he also believed we couldn't tell if you're good or bad until we could look at the sum of your life. If you're interested in all of that, you should read After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. And there's another crash course on this. So there you go. Different approaches. Do you have to pick one? Of course not. Of course not. You can, sample from column A and column B and C and D. You should aspire to be virtuous. You should try to act in a way that does good for people. You should honor your commitments, and you should, be aware that you have a duty to act in certain ways. These are all things that inform ethical behavior. So we make decisions. What goes into that? What does the research tells us goes into that? Unconscious thoughts, right? We are driven by heuristics, and we're prone to bias, and we all are, all the time. And sometimes that's helpful, and sometimes that's not helpful. There's unthinking custom and practice. This is stuff you've absorbed from your family, or from your church, or from your community, or from your friend group. You've absorbed a set of things so that you fit in with them, you get along with them. And this is fine. Many times this is fine stuff. Growing up, we had to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's because we had to. You had to do it. And if people didn't do that, my parents were like, what's wrong with them? Where did that come from? I don't know, but that's what I learned growing up. And so now I'm like, it's 2 years. Do I need to eat black-eyed peas? I don't like black-eyed peas. I guess not. There's personal ethical decision making. We just covered that, right? What do you value? How do you think you should make decisions? And there's reflective practice, right? If everything else fails, you'll just have to think about stuff. And then you'll be making conscious decisions, hopefully in context, but given all the other clutter that you've accumulated from everything above it, right? You've got other clutter in your brain. Life's too short to rethink all of your prior decisions. It's just not something that you're going to be able to do. But you can, as you're evaluating them, you can think, why do I think that? Or why do I believe that to be true? Do I have a reason? Is it a good reason? Maybe I'm wrong. Right? One of the great gifts that you can give yourself, in my opinion, it's just my opinion now, not research talking anymore, it's just my opinion, is you can say, am I right? And discovering that you're wrong, or that you don't have a justification for it, and changing your mind about something is one of the best gifts you can give yourself. So let's talk about making ethical decisions. We need to be able to do that. So there are many ways to approach ethical decision making, and having a procedure, a set of steps that you can fall back on, can help, because it can help you avoid being hijacked by system one, right? You've engaged more of your brain. You've got a process you're following, and that helps you set aside that emotional stuff, that other baggage, and just focus on the steps and see where they lead you. The literature on this, there's a bunch of different ones out there, but one of the ones that's very widely cited and has a pretty good theoretical basis behind it is called the 7-step method for ethical decision making. And there's more than one 7-step method for ethical decision making. We're going to focus on the one that actually has research backing it up. And that research comes to us from this shady-looking fellow over here on the right. Shady-looking guy. What's up with those sideburns? So Michael Davis proposed these 7 steps. And we start with the obvious. State the problem, right? So what is it? Why are you doing this? Right? I mean, if it's, you don't apply 7 steps of ethical decision making to decide what to have for lunch. You don't apply the 7 steps of ethical decision making to decide whether you should swerve to avoid an accident or not, or whether you should swerve to avoid hitting a pedestrian or not, right? Something is happening that's causing you to be concerned. You're like, I don't know what the right choice is ethically. I need a way to think about it and reach a decision. So what is it? What is it about that decision that concerns you? And write that down, right? Or at least say it out loud. What is it that concerns you? Check the facts. So gather and assess the relevant data, right? What's involved in the decision? Are there non-ethical concerns, right? Maybe legally there's only one thing you can do. Well, maybe you should do the legal thing. Michael Davis argues that a lot of these challenges go away when you begin to gather the facts and you realize that there's a policy or there's a legal framework, etc. on this. So you're like, should I accept this gift? Someone I work with at a contractor who works for my company has offered me this gift. Should I accept it? I don't know. I mean, I guess it could be the perception of favoritism or conflict of interest. Should I accept it? It turns out there's a policy. I can accept it as long as it's less than $50 in value. Well, it is. Okay, I'll accept it, right? So a lot of times there's something that will help you at that stage. But let's assume that doesn't do it. So then we go on and we say we identify the relevant factors. What are all the things that go into this decision? People who are implicated or involved or engaged in this, laws, professional codes, all the little pieces that you need in order to pull together to make the decision. Now, step 4, develop a list of options. What are your options? I can tell him, no, I won't accept the gift, or yes, I will accept the gift. Are those my only 2 options? Like, be creative, think, be imaginative. What if I accept it, but I then, so what if he gives me this gift? Let's say the gift is a plate of cookies. So instead I accept the cookies, but then I set them out for everyone in the office to have one. Maybe that's an option. Or he gives me tickets to a game. And I say, you know what, I can't accept these directly, but I can give them to the company, and the company can maybe cash them in and do something with that. Or there's a number of things that I could potentially do, and think imaginatively about what those are. Test the options. We'll get to that on the next slide, so hang on that one. Down select. So once you've done the testing, which we'll talk about in a moment, this should help you down select and say, well, these options are are bad, and these options are probably okay, and maybe these options are really good. So you can then down select and then finally make your decision. And at this stage, he recommends you go back up to the start, right? You started this process because you didn't know what to do. And maybe what you need to do is add a new policy. Or maybe you've just become aware of a policy along the way. But if you made it to the end, probably not. So maybe you need a new policy. You need to clarify existing policies. You need to do something else so that the next time you or someone like you is confronted by this dilemma, you know what to do. So what are the tests he proposes? Well, there are 7 of them. There's the harm test. Does one option do less harm than the others? We talked about this before. The 4 different approaches we talked about, ethical approaches, all have this notion of treating people well. That's kind of the basis for all of them. Be good to other people because they're conscious creatures just like you are. And so does one do less harm than the others? Okay, that maybe is the one I want to choose, right? And that could be harm to other people, harm to yourself, reputational harm to your company, harm to your family, whatever. Choose the thing that does the least harm, right? Doctors are trying to minimize harm. You should be trying to minimize harm too. The publicity test. How would you feel if your decision was made public? And I'll change that a little bit and say, how will you feel when your decision is made public? I believe nothing stays secret forever. And so when your decision is inevitably made public, how will you feel about that? Will you be like, yes, I made that decision. That's the decision I made. Maybe I had imperfect information, but based on what I know, I feel I did the right thing at the time. Or will you be like, oh no, they're going to find out I did that. Okay, well, one of those is clearly a better outcome than the other. So that's a good test. Defensibility, right? How will you defend your choice to others? That's something that you should think about, right? Your boss comes to you and says, why'd you do this? You say, well, I did it for the following reasons. Maybe those reasons were invalid, or maybe there was something I didn't know, but that's why I did it. And you can defend it. The reversibility test. I decided to take an action. Well, what if someone else decided to take that same action and I was the target? How would I feel? Right? If I don't want that, then I shouldn't do it to someone else. The colleague test. How would your colleagues, or maybe a governing board at your university or company or however, how will they react to your choice? Organizational tests, right? Maybe what I do is I get up and I go and I talk to the ethics officer or the legal counsel. So I've done that at the lab. I've had a couple different occasions where I've gone and talked to the lab's general counsel, and I said, what do I do in this circumstance? And they sit there and they tap the table with their fingers while they think about it, and they give me really good advice. Every time I've done this, I've gotten really good advice from them. And then finally, there's the virtue test, right? Going back to Aristotle. Would a virtuous person do what you're proposing to do? What kind of person would do the thing that you're proposing to do? And if you do that thing, what does that say about you? So those are the 7 tests. If one of your options makes it through all those tests, great. It's probably a reasonable thing to do. If they fail all the tests, you shouldn't do it. You just shouldn't do it. All right. If you want to watch a video with an AI recorded monotone voice and lots of stock footage of people in conference rooms, there's one here that will walk you through the ethical decision making process, the 7-step method. And that takes us to ethics in software development. So security issues typically arise when I have an interface, right? One system connects to another system, or one component connects to another, or I invoke an API. And that's where things go off the rails and I wind up with lots of problems, right? Because there's something that I haven't considered. There's information being passed I'm not aware of, or I've got things wrong, or an assumption about how things work is wrong. Ethical issues tend to arise when there's an interface with a human user, or when there's an interface with their data. Those are the places where you really have to watch out for this stuff. The basic principle that should govern all of this interaction is that people should be treated as ends in themselves and not as a means to an end, right? It's easy to think, well, people they're the product of the company. Your data is the product, and we're just mining people to accumulate this data so that we can sell it. No, that's the wrong way to think about it. That's clearly not an ethical way to think about your fellow human beings. If you collect and process data about the public, then you are in a position of public trust, and you should act accordingly. If you store data about users, then you should prioritize some things above others, and those things are transparency, security, and autonomy. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. But again, storing data about the public, you are in a position of public trust. People are putting their trust in you to behave responsibly with their information. Transparency, that all comes down to having a data policy that is clearly communicated, is understandable. That's what you want. It's transparency. Clear communication. Users know what you're collecting. They know why you're collecting it, what you intend to use it for. That's good, right? They know, I'm going to give you this data. You're going to use it for the purpose of fulfilling this request, or for the purpose of showing me targeted ads, or whatever you're going to use it for. Okay, fine. Tell them the truth. Tell them what you're going to use it for and how you're going to use it clearly. And when I say clearly, I mean have accessible policies. Easily understandable policies that avoid technical and legal jargon. Right? If you have your lawyer write up some impenetrable legalese that's 20,000 words long, I don't know what that means. So don't do that. All right? Have a non-technical person read the policy, and then you can ask them questions to see if they understand the policy and it's been communicated to them clearly. And update proactively. Ideally, right, over time, you're going to change what you do with data. You're going to learn new stuff, and you're going to want to learn new stuff. You're going to want to use the data in different ways. That's fine. But let users know about it, right? Notify them promptly. Ideally, you'll notify them in advance about changes to your data collection and usage practices, but you will let them know. Security, be a good steward of the data that is entrusted to you. If you've got data, encrypt it, right? Encrypt your data, right? You put your milk in the refrigerator, you put your trash in a trash can, you put your data in an encrypted volume somewhere. You encrypt it at rest, you encrypt it in motion, just encrypt your data. Encryption's not hard, it's not nightmarish, right? If you have data that is sensitive, you should encrypt it. Access controls need to exist. Who can get access to your data? Just anybody? Can they get the information and stalk their ex-girlfriends? Ideally, no, right? Ideally, the data is accessible to people who need it in a way that is consistent with your data collection policy. And there are regular audits, right? Regularly go and audit your security and make sure that you mitigate vulnerabilities. Just be responsible when you're dealing with other people's information. And finally, autonomy. Right? Treat the data as if it belongs to the user. Does it? Does it belong to the user? Well, in a sense it does, but the collected database that you've got, that's yours, right? So should I just say, hey, this is mine. I'm going to do what I want to with it. That's not a way to engender trust from people. It's not a great way to behave, and it's probably going to get you in trouble in the long run. So ideally, you'll have a data policy that has a right to access so people can see what data has been collected about them, a right to correct so people can correct inaccurate information. Sometimes people have the same name or something else is the same. Something goes wrong, there's a bug. Whatever happens, you wind up with bad data. This happens to people, and it can be a nightmare when it happens. Don't be the cause of somebody else's nightmare. People have been incorrectly flagged as registered sex offenders. They've had their credit destroyed. They've had to fight companies for years over bad data. Companies sell data sets to each other so that bad data can spread. They publish it in different ways and provide it to the government so that bad data can have impacts far beyond what was initially intended. Give people the right to correct inaccurate and outdated information. Give them the right to opt out altogether. Right? They want to be out of your system. Okay, let them delete their data. And portability, right? Maybe they just given up on you. They want to take their data and go. Okay, fine. Provide a means to download the data in a portable format and let them go somewhere else. Right? All these are ways to be responsible with data about people who aren't you, right? And to treat other people as ends in themselves and not as a means for you to sell advertising or whatever else. You got to do that, right? But you can do that in different ways. You can do that in an ethical way or in an unethical way. And you need to make decisions that are good and healthy long-term, both for yourself and for your company. That covers data. Let's talk about users. Be respectful of your users and avoid manipulating them. This idea of manipulating users is often called dark patterns. We'll go over those in just a moment. If you want to avoid the dark patterns, you can get there by just emphasizing transparency, which we've already talked about, autonomy, and consent. If you emphasize those things, you will avoid all these dark patterns. Okay? What do I mean by dark patterns? Well, the Roach Motel. It's easy to get in, but it's hard to get out, right? It's easy to sign up for a cable, but it's really a pain in the neck to cancel it. You've got to call, you've got to call back and say, I want to cancel my cable. And they're like, well, Jill's not here and she handles cancellation. Well, when is Jill there? Well, she's here on Tuesdays, but she's off now because she's in the hospital because of this or that, and she might be here next Tuesday. Well, can I leave a message for her? No, I'm not here. I'm going to be going on vacation. Well, can I just leave a message? Well, no, there's not really a way to do that. We're not sure when Jill's going to be back. I just want to cancel my cable. So, making things very difficult, right? Signing up for a subscription service, but making it really hard to figure out how to get out of it. Bait and switch, right? The user wants one thing. They want to download an image, or they download a sound file, or download a game, or whatever else that you're providing. And that's great, but you think it would be better if they also downloaded some adware to go with that. So what you do is you give them that, but you also download some other stuff with it. That's not good. Don't do that. That's bad. Nagging. Constantly hassling people with pop-ups, right? So you open the app and it says, do you want to rate us? You're like, no, I don't want to rate you right now. And then it immediately says, do you want to rate us again? Do you want to rate us? And it keeps asking you, do you want to rate the app, rate the app, rate the app, rate the app, rate the app? And it's like driven nuts by this. It becomes hard to use because of the constant interruptions about rating the ad or subscribing to a service. It's just constantly bugging you with that. Until finally some people will just give up and say, okay, fine, I'll do it. And I don't know how this one got its name. This is what they call it. I don't know how that comes about. Really, this is just what it's called. Tricking users into sharing more data than they intended to share. For example, a social media site might default to very open and permissive sharing policies about your data. And say, well, sure, your data is being broadcast to the world, but if you don't like that, there's a settings page that you can go and find and change all these options. And then you're just like, where's the settings? I can't find it. And you dig around, you can't find the settings page. It's buried behind something, or it's through some weird link. And it's very difficult to figure it out when you get there, how you can modify the settings. Pre-selected defaults, right? So you pop up the little download button and it says, in one of the little buttons is checked and it says, include a copy of McAfee antivirus. I don't want that. Don't download that. Why am I go ahead and sign me up for a 6-month subscription to this magazine. No, don't do that. I don't want that, right? Don't automatically check those, right? If they're not paying attention, they'll just click right through, and then they get a bunch of stuff they don't want. Other concerns are collecting data without consent or against policy, or hiding it behind confusing policies, right? Click this button if you want to disable your opt-out to enable us to use your data for targeted advertising that benefits you with improved advertising. So do I click it? Unclicking it? Click it if you don't want to disable. What does it mean? If I don't click it, am I enable? Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Designing systems exploit user psychology and encourage excessive use. Wow. It seems like everything is doing that right now. The algorithm is there to promote engagement. And boy, that's a slippery slope, right? It's not me. It's the algorithm that's doing it. It's showing you what you want to see. It's showing you stuff that you like. And I can't help the fact that you're on the site so much because it's showing you stuff that's good. Designing a system in a way such that users are prevented from moving to another service. It's not great, right? You build up a relationship with this service, but you can't get out of it. Theft of intellectual property, also very bad. And the guiding principle, again, treat people as ends in themselves and not as a means to an end.